So today we're going to talk all about census records. So what is the census? Hopefully you know a little bit about the census because you've probably, had to take it yourself. But if you're not sure what the census is, it's an official, complete count of the population of a nation, state, or other geographic region. You're probably familiar with taking surveys, but this isn't like a survey. I mean, it's kind of like a survey, but it's more than just a sampling of people. When you usually do a survey, it's just a small subset of people. This one aims to count every single person. So the official Census Bureau says that their goal is to count everyone once, only once, and in the right place. But the reality of that, of course, is that some people are counted more than once. Some people are missed entirely, and some people are counted in the wrong place. So, of course, there's always human error with anything. So the census is going to contain information about a population's demographics. So you learn about the age of people, the sex of people, their occupation, and then they also include some other data like about the region's agricultural and business sectors. So we're talking about some special censuses that are just for those sectors as well. And although a lot of the information, of course, is statistical purposes, the data that we can glean from the census is also really great for us genealogists because it provides information on our ancestors. So, why should you research the census? Well, it helps you document family relationships and it helps you place your ancestors in a specific location at a specific time. So, unfortunately, not every census is very explicit about the relationships, which we'll see when we look at some examples. And even the ones that are, that it might say, oh, this is the wife or the son or the daughter, we still want to verify that fact with additional sources because we don't know where the information is coming from or who in that household is giving the information. And maybe it's a stepdaughter, not a biological daughter. So maybe they're not making that differentiation in the census. So more sources are always better than less sources. You can also use the census to learn more about your ancestors' life. So you can learn their occupation, what level of schooling they attained, if they were a naturalized citizen, which we're going to talk all about next month. If they owned a home or if they lived on a farm, you can also learn that in the census. Of course, all the different details that are in each census are going to vary year to year and depending on the location, because of course, international censuses are different from US censuses. There's even state censuses during specific years, and they're all going to be different depending on the location, depending on the time period. You can also use the census for additional research. So it might give you some clues. So in the census, it might list a birth year and a location, and that could lead you to then discovering a birth record for your ancestor. If it says they were born approximately 1901 in Wisconsin, now you have an approximate time period and at least a state to look at. Some censuses even get a little more detailed when we see an example where see some of them even give the county that a person is born in if you're looking at state censuses. So like I said, each census is going to give different data, ask different questions. The older censuses in the United States, the ones that are before 1850, ask very few questions. So if your ancestors date back further than 1850, it's a little more difficult to find a family and learn a lot of details about them before 1850, but don't let that discourage you. Some questions you might see on one census and hope that it's going to be on the next census, and it's not. So census year to census year, there are different questions every time. But generally, between 1850 and 1950, which is the most current census that we genealogists have access to, you can get this information for every member of the household. So you can get their name, their age, their state or country of birth, the birthplace of their parents, the year of immigration if they were an immigrant, their street address, their marital status, their occupation or occupations, and the value of their home and personal belongings. And if you're curious about, what questions were asked during the census when your ancestor or your specific ancestor that you're looking for, there's a link in your handout that goes through all the different questions that are asked in each census. So you can scroll through this and look through all the different details. You can click on the different census years. Of course, it's going to show you the more recent censuses, even though those aren't available to genealogists. But for example, I could go down to the 1880 census and then learn all about it and read much more in depth, see a blank form, and see what kind of questions are going to be asked. So that is a link in your handout for you. Well, you might be wondering why only up to 1950? Because there's a privacy law in the United States. They have a 72-year restriction on access to the US censuses. So right now, we as genealogists can only access 1790, which is the first US census, all the way up to 1950, which was just released a few years ago. We can thankfully find them online on most major genealogy websites, and I'll show you how to find them on a few of them this afternoon. Unfortunately, for the 1960 census, we have to wait all the way till April of 2032, which is still a ways to go to wait for that, unfortunately. So now we're going to look at a few examples. So here is an example of the 1850 census from New York that you can look and see what kind of questions were asked. You can see what data there is for specific people. I'm just going to zoom in here so you can see it. So you can see all the way at the top, it's going to tell you what county it's, or what city or what town it's in. So this is Manlius in the county of Onondaga in the state of New York. It's telling you when it was enumerated. So in August of 1850. So this is the information and the time period that we're looking at. Then over here, you can see, kind of what house number that they were and what family number, order that they were being asked these questions. You can see the name of every person that's living here, but note that it says from the first day of June of 1850. So even though they're taking this in August, they're asking about the 1st of June. They're asking for their age, their sex, what color they are, their profession, occupation, or trade, but just for male people over the age of 15. The value of their real estate owned, their place of birth. It says name the state, territory, or country. If they were married within the year, you'll see a little tick mark here. If they attended school within the year, you'd see a tick mark in that column. If they are a person over 20 years of age who cannot read or write, you would see a tick mark in there. And then the last column asks if they were deaf and dumb, blind, insane, idiotic, pauper, or a convict. And unfortunately, those are the terms that they're using in the census in 1850, even though we don't feel like those are appropriate terms to use nowadays. So then you would find your family in the census, and I'll show you how to search later, but you can see all the different names of all the people. So you can see, this is one of my ancestors. I can see he's a laborer and he's age 27 and he was born in New York and he's, not attending school or anything like that, like this person above him is. So that's just an example of the questions they asked in 1850. So fast forward 100 years and in a different state. Now we're going to look at a 1950 census example for the state of Wisconsin. So you can see already visually it looks different than that 1851. So up at the top, we still get, where it's located, what county, what state. Still get a lot of other little details on who the enumerator was, all that kind of stuff. And then you can see all the different details. So it asks specific questions for the heads of households, like the house number, if it's a farm or a ranch, if it's a house on a place of 3 or more acres. There's an agricultural number. If they were also part of the agricultural census, which we'll talk about a little bit later, they would have a number here. Then they're asking about the name of the head of the household. What are the names of the other people who live there? So they're saying you want to list it in a specific order. The head, their wife, unmarried sons and daughters in the order of their age, married sons and daughters and their families, other relatives, other people, such as lodgers, roomers, maids, or hired hands who live in, and their relatives. And then in the next column, they're going to enter their relationship. So they give a couple examples like the wife, the daughter, the grandson, the mother-in-law, etc., etc. Next, we've got race, sex, how old was this person on their last birthday? And if they are under the age of a year old, you enter the month of their birth, so April, May, December, etc. Then they ask for the marital status, so if they're married, if they're widowed, if they're divorced, separated, or never married, and they use some abbreviations, which they show you here. What state or foreign country was this person born in? And if they were born outside of the continental United States, you should enter the territory or foreign country. And if you're supposed to try to distinguish, like if it's Canada-French or Canada-other. If they were foreign born, you're also going to ask if that person's naturalized, and then they've got a couple little details here on what each of the little things mean. And then they get into the occupation. So these questions are just asked for people who are 14 years of age and older. So they're asking, what did this person do most of last week? Were they working? Were they keeping house or doing something else? Did this person do any work at all last week, not counting work around the house? Was this person looking for work? Even though he didn't work last week, does he have a job or a business? How many hours did he work last week? So asking very specific details about that occupation that they have. And what kind of work are they doing? What kind of business or industry is that in? And what kind of class of worker is that? So you can see all these little details that really get to the nitty-gritty of what your ancestor's doing. And then you see there's actually special little lines. So you'll see a couple of examples here. That means that they got asked additional questions. So if your family is featured here where there's an extra line here, you want to also then continue down to the bottom. So you can see actually my great-grandfather here was one of the special people. He's number 25. He got asked additional questions. So then I'm going to scroll down here and see all these additional questions. So they're asking, are they living here? And it's the same spot that they were living a year ago. Were they living on a farm a year ago? Were they living in the same country? What country and state were they living in if it wasn't this place? What country were his father and mother born in? What's the highest grade of school they attended? Did they finish that grade? Have they attended school since February? And then more details about different occupational things, money, wages, all that kind of fun stuff. So you can, of course, read through those questions. And then about their service in World War II, World War I, or any other time. So you can see all those little details. So sometimes you might see that there was nobody on that line. For some reason, they must have skipped that line. But for my ancestor, who was number 25, these would be where they would answer those questions for him. So again, just like the other census we looked at, you can see all the various details and get all this amazing stuff on your ancestors. So that's just an example of what two censuses look like. Of course, again, they all ask different questions. They're all going to look a little slightly different, depending on what year you're looking at. So you might be wondering, well, how did they gather all this data? Well, in the United States, we take the census federally, starting all the way back in 1790, and then every 10 years since then, so 1800, 1810, 1820, we have taken a census. So the most recent census we did was 2020. We're taking another one in 2030. Then individual states within the US and other countries have also taken censuses at various points, but it's usually different time periods or different years than those US censuses. So for example, in the state of Wisconsin, we also did a state census in 1855, 1865, 75, 85, 95, and 1905. And then before we became a state in 1848, we even took a few territorial censuses. So that was before we were officially a state. So it's really awesome that, in between these 10-year gaps, which is quite a lot of time, you can use those state censuses, you can use city directories, you can use tax lists, in addition to these federal censuses to try to track your ancestor as much as possible every possible year between those 10-year gaps of the census and kind of create a little timeline. Are they still living in Appleton year after year after year? Or are they in Appleton in 1800 and then in 1820 somewhere else? So you can kind of follow them all throughout time during their life. To get an idea of what censuses might exist for what years and how to access them, I always start with the Family Search Wiki. So you would search something like New York Census, and it's going to list special censuses, if there's any sort of loss, and then what years they took a federal census, what years they took a state census, all that kind of great stuff. So the Family Search Wiki is something that I use very often, especially when I'm just beginning researching on a specific thing. So you can come here and just search right by topic or by place or both. So we're going to put New York Census. And it's going to tell me, of course, what I just said. Starting in 1790, we've got federal censuses every 10 years. And it's going to give me some links here. So I can go search all the federal censuses for New York, specifically on these sites. And I can see they've got other types of non-population schedules that are also similar to censuses, like for veterans, for mortality, for different agricultural, social statistics, all this stuff. We'll talk a little bit later today about what each of these are. And then you can see, okay, there's also some state censuses during these specific years, but some counties are missing. If they name all of the people in the house or if they just name the head of the household. So it gives you this kind of data and then even gives you links on where you can find those indexes and those images for those years. So again, you can do this with every state. You can even do it for international places. So I could go up here again and I could search Germany census. And now it's going to give me a little introduction because of course the census is going to be different in Germany and it's going to tell me all this details about what I need to know about researching in the census when it was taken in this specific country. So this is a great starting point for you and it also gives you links for more information or to start searching in those areas if it's online. So in the United States, somebody called an enumerator, which is what they call the census takers, went door to door and talked to an adult of the household. So from 1790, when the census first started, up until 1870, they had the US Marshals act as the enumerators of the census, and they'd be doing this job to gather all this data that you see on those censuses. Starting in 1870, they decided, hey, we're going to hire enumerators. They're going to be special people that are just employed for this little time period and go do this. And one of your ancestors even could have been somebody who was an enumerator at this time, who would have had that as their occupation for a time period. There's a great document that I've linked in your handout called Measuring America. In addition to all the census questions and all the instructions it has, it tells you what an enumerator did, how they conducted it a lot more in depth than me talking about it for 1 minute. But it might help you also understand why your ancestor would have answered a specific question in that specific way. So it's very, very long document. It's about 149 pages, all about the census from 1790 to 2000. So very in-depth. If you're curious about learning more, I definitely encourage you to check that out. So when that enumerator came to your ancestor's house, that adult that they talked to provided information on each of the people in the household. And the enumerator wrote it down, of course. Well, unfortunately, other than in the 1940 census, we have no clue who in that household is providing that information. Was it the head of the household? Was it the wife? Was it the adult son, the adult daughter who's living with them? We don't know. Thankfully, in the 1940 census, they were smart and they made a little X or a little X with a circle in it next to a person's name. So I know my great grandma Florence was the one who provided this information. So I know she's probably pretty right about how old she is and where she's born and stuff and where her husband was born and what his name is, what her son's name is. I would hope she would know that information. It's not just some random person providing that information. The enumerator sometimes, just like we make notes, they made notes that sometimes they copied then to an official census record if they didn't bring an official form with them. Sometimes, especially in those rural areas, they got a little creative. And at certain times, there weren't official census records. So some of the really early censuses, they didn't have them pre-printed on these beautiful forms like we just looked at. They kind of had to make do and kind of make their own census almost. But of course, during this, errors can happen along the way. Maybe as they copied their information, or maybe as they misheard the information. Maybe somebody's accent was really thick, or our ancestors, they didn't always know how to spell their name, and maybe the census taker didn't know how to either. So they spelled it out phonetically, or spelled it out how they thought it sounded, or something like that. So sometimes you're going to find lots of creative spelling. The person who's also making those notes could have or the person providing that information, the informant, could have misremembered. So if you ask me how old I am today, I've got to do the math in my head, just like our ancestors probably had to do the math in their head. Like, how old am I? Am I 42? Am I 45? Maybe they're going to give you a little guesstimate. Or if they're answering that question about, each of their 7 kids or their 10 kids, they might be a little off. Or maybe they knowingly gave incorrect information or deliberately falsified it. Think about it. Did they have a reason to lie? Especially when we look at a question like, hey, are you a US citizen? Maybe they say, yeah, I am, because it's their neighbor asking that question and they don't want their neighbor to know that they're not a US citizen, because at certain time periods, if you're an Irish immigrant or a German immigrant and you're not a US citizen, we don't like you. So there's different, anti-immigrant sentiment times that, maybe that's the reason why they lied and said yes, or maybe they're partway through the process, so they said, oh yeah, I'm a citizen, no big deal. But we don't know for sure. Or again, maybe somebody's giving that information on their behalf and they think, oh yeah, they finished that process, and not realizing, nope, they still have one step of the process to finish. And sometimes, especially in our earlier census years, sometimes they asked the neighbors, like if you weren't home when that census taker came, he said, hey, who lives there? Tell me about them. And they kind of went off that. So again, even though the goal is to capture everybody in the right spot, with all the right details, the reality is there's misinformation in the census, unfortunately. Still a great genealogical tool, though, for our ancestors, and why we want to try to find additional sources for all the facts that we find in the census, so we can kind of further prove or deny the information that is presented in the census. So before 1830, the government didn't have those standard pre-printed forms like we see. So the enumerators, had their own paper, they lined it by hand. And so when you're looking at those very early censuses, if your ancestors were here from 1790 to 1830, they're all going to look different because the enumerators had to make do with what they had. The other kind of cool things that happened in census history is beginning in 1960, which is the next census we have access to as genealogists. The census began mailing questionnaires to houses instead of going door to door and bothering everybody and maybe missing people while they're at the work. They mailed questionnaires and tried to get responses for as many people as possible. And then they only went door to door for those people who didn't respond by mail. And even nowadays, you can complete the census online or by phone. So it's a lot more convenient than somebody having to go door to door to door to door all throughout, the month of April. Still, unfortunately, the census is not 100% accurate. Even now, with all the different ways we have, all the different technologies, they're going to overcount some people, undercount other people. It just happens. You can see the US Census website for a lot more history, a lot more information on historically what the census was, how it was conducted, all that stuff. And then internationally, of course, we're really focusing on the US Census, but you might be able to learn a lot more about the different countries and how they conducted their census in that Family Search Wiki that we just looked at. So now you are probably wondering about, how do you find your ancestors in the census? Well, it's a little easier nowadays to search in the census because all of the US federal censuses until 1950 that we have access to are indexed and they're digitized on the major genealogy websites like Family Search Ancestry, both the paid edition and the library edition that's free, and Heritage Quest, which for you Wisconsin people, you can access for free from home. So you just have to provide your library card number or your zip code for Wisconsin, and you get access to that. For those virtual folks who don't live in Wisconsin, check with your local library, see if you have access to Heritage Quest as well. Also, some of the state censuses and some of the non-population schedules, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and even some international censuses are also available online on some of these genealogy websites, but not all of them have been digitized. For example, I know from researching my Wisconsin ancestors that some of the non-population schedules are not online yet. So my ancestors were a lot of farmers. Well, they did an agricultural census during specific years that asked all these questions about their farm. In order for me to go to access those, the closest place for us here in Appleton is up in Green Bay at the Brown County Library. They have microfilm. If you go look at the drawers of microfilm, they have census microfilm. And at the end of the regular census, that's where you're going to find all these special censuses, like the agricultural ones, the manufacturing ones, the mortality schedules, all that great stuff that is not digitized and online yet. If you don't live in this Northeast Wisconsin area, also Madison, the Wisconsin Historical Society is also a great resource that has those on microfilm as well. But of course, every country is going to handle the census different and their access to them, which is why I always recommend checking the wiki on Family Search, because Canada, our neighbors to the north, they just released their 1931 census 2 years ago because they have a 92-year restriction, which is different than our 72-year restriction. So every country is going to handle it different. And some of it might be online, some of it might not be online. So that's why I would always start with that Family Search wiki. So on these websites, you can search for a person by name, but as we talked about a few minutes ago, there's going to be a lot of misspellings, especially with our last names. Our last names are going to be spelled very creatively. There's going to be incorrect indexing of records too, because in some cases it's computers that are trying to read this. Or, before we had computers, somebody would have to read it and guess what they thought. Is that a K? Is that an S? Is that an L? And then type it in. So there's going to be some misindexing. There was this great quote from a professional genealogist, Debbie Gertler, at Roots Tech 2024, which is this big genealogy conference that they do every year online and in Salt Lake City. And I thought this was a perfect way to sum up why it's important to continue searching. She said, if you haven't tried to search 5, 6, 7 different ways, you haven't tried hard enough. So don't just put in your last name and say, oh, there's no results. They must not be in the census. You got to try spelling your name 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different ways and get creative with how you're searching sometimes to track down these ancestors. For a really long time, I couldn't find my ancestors in Chicago in the 1900 census, I want to say. I finally broke through last year and found them because I got creative with how I was searching. I ended up tracking down their address approximately for that year and searching by their address. And their name is just completely butchered in that census, which explains why I couldn't find them, even the 10 different ways I spelled their names or the multiple different ways I tried to search. So don't give up. They might still be there. You might have to go page by page sometimes if it's a smaller location to see if you can find your ancestors there because the name is just so butchered in the index or on the actual census. I've also got some great tips and tricks for you that I'm going to give you that hopefully will help you locate your ancestors a little easier, things that I've learned quite a bit throughout the years. One tip is using wildcards. So if you're not familiar with wildcards, these can help you search, especially in these census records that are a little bit more difficult, but you can also use them with other record types depending on what website you're using. So a wildcard will replace a single unknown letter. So if you have a last name of Nielsen and there might be an E in between the S and the N, or an O in between the S and the N, or any other random letter in there, you can put a wildcard right in between the S and the N. You can also use a wildcard to find names that begin with the same letters. You can find first letters, so maybe it's an S that's misindexed as a K, for example. Or maybe there's alternative spellings of the same name. So my niece's name is Kaylee. How many different ways are there to spell Kaylee? I just thought of 4 off the top of my head. There's probably more than that. People are getting creative with how they spell names. So you can use wildcards to get around that and not have to search all the different spellings of one name. So you're going to use the star, which you can find on your keyboard. It's going to represent between 0 and 5 characters. So it's that shift and the letter 8 or the number 8 on your PC if you have a PC computer, or if you have a little keypad like I do, it kind of looks like that time sign above your 9. So for example, if I put in the search box MAT star, it's going to give me results like Matthew spelt with 1 T or 2 T's. It's going to give me Matthias spelt with 2 T's and 1 T. It's going to give me Matilda spelled with an H and without an H. So you kind of got to get creative depending on what you're searching for. That one's a little bit more broad. We're going to get a lot of results that way, but that's just kind of a basic example of how you might use that star wildcard. The other wild card is the question mark. So that represents just one character. So you would use that shift and the question mark key on your PC if you have a PC. So just like I showed you before, if you've got Nielsen as a last name, you can put that question mark between the S and the N to get the Nielsen spelled with an E, with an O, with an A, etc., etc. So if that's a commonly misspelled letter in between those two other letters, you can throw that question mark in there, and it's going to give you all the different variations just in that one spot. One important thing to know about wildcards is that all of them must contain at least 3 non-wildcard letters. So for example, I could use star ILL, but star IL would not work because it doesn't have enough extra characters in addition to that wildcard. So if I put star ILL, I could get Will, I could get Jill, I could get Bill, etc., for my search. Also, the first and the last character in your search can't both be wildcards. So if you want to search Johnson, for example, you could put a question mark in the first letter, or you could put that star at the end, but you can't put a question mark and a star at the beginning and the end. That's not going to work. You can do it elsewhere as long as it's not in the beginning and the end to get those wildcards. Certain sites also have what's called SoundX, which is kind of like this weird algorithm that they used to use that was like, it sounds like this. So sometimes sites will automatically have it turned on. You want to make sure that's unchecked if you're going to be using a wildcard, because otherwise it's not going to work and it's going to give you no results. So it might say like, hey, Smith spelled a couple different ways. If the SoundX is on, it's going to give you names that sound similar to Smith as well. So I'm going to show you a quick demo of how to search in Heritage Quest. And also, since the last time we did anything with Heritage Quest, they made an awesome update where you can now search by the first name, last name, place lived, birthplace, all that kind of great stuff that I complained about for a long time that Heritage Quest did not allow us to do. Now they finally listened to us and gave us a search box. So if you're in Wisconsin, you're welcome to use any of your local libraries. Of course, since we're here in Appleton, I'm going to use APL's website. So you can go to apl.org. You're going to click on eLibrary. You can narrow down to genealogy right here or continue scrolling down through the alphabetical listings. But then here is our Heritage Quest. So from here, now they made it so nice and beautiful, I can search for my ancestor's name right here. So I'm going to put in their name. If you click on birth, for example, like maybe I just know he's born approximately this year and in this location, I can do that, or I can put other details here as well. Now I'm going to click search. And now, of course, it's going to give me a couple other results of things, but if I just want to narrow it down to the census records, you can see there's census and voter lists here on the left-hand side. I can just click on that and it's only going to show me those types of records. So now I can see him right here in the 1940 census. I can kind of get a little snapshot of, oh, he's living in Madison in 1940. Yeah, that kind of tracks with maybe what I know about him, or no, it doesn't track. That doesn't seem like the right person. So if you're ready to look at that record, you just click on that little image and it's going to bring you right into the census. And it helpfully highlights where that family is on the page. So you can just zoom in and read all the details. And Ancestry and Heritage Quest even give you a little kind of, this is what this is, without having to scroll all the way at the top to see what each column means, which is very helpful, especially if your ancestors are towards the middle of the page or towards the bottom of the page. So again, you see all these great details about them. And you'll notice there's also a couple supplemental questions for certain people, not as many as the 1950 census, but hopefully one of your ancestors is on one of those supplemental lines and you get some additional details if you scroll down to the bottom here. Another way to search in Heritage Quest, because of course they have more than just the US censuses, I also wanted to show you can go to search and you can do your search right here as well. You can search a specific census year, like if you're really trying to find them in the 1910 census and you just want to look at the 1910 census, you can click on it and go right into that search, and it would just search for that year. Another thing you can do, you can see all the other great records they have on here, but they've got other international records here completely for free for you. So another thing I could do, say I want to search for people in South America, I can click on that. And look at right here, I can see they have an 1869 national census for Argentina. Maybe that's something I want to search for, and I can go ahead and click in it and see, right there, I just put in the details there. It's going to search in there, or I can even browse through it. I can pick a specific, Buenos Aires, and I don't know what any of this stuff means, but I can just click on it and be brought into the census. And you can see it's going to look completely different than a US census. So if we just skim through a couple pages, it's completely different. It's, of course, also in a different language. So, if you're searching those international censuses, you need to know a little bit of other languages and what things are. Some things you might be able to understand, like nombre, that seems like a name, that seems pretty obvious. This seems like an age, that seems like a sex. Of course, certain details you might be able to pick out even if it's in a different language. Any questions about searching the census in Heritage Quest? See if we've got any online questions here. Someone just shared they found one branch of their family in the 1940 census under the surname Yardner. The actual surname is Gardner with a G, but of course on the census, the G was very ornate and looked like Y. So again, that's why we might use a wild card, putting that question mark at the beginning to see what kind of fun misspellings there might be. Someone says, I've been studying the 1950 census in Lee County in Virginia. There are codes in the margin. I'm wondering how I can look into the meaning of those. So I believe that link that I put in your handout all about decoding the census and stuff, I forget what the official name was, but I believe it mentions some of the codes. So you'd go to that specific census year, the 1950 census, and it's going to talk about the different codes that they would put in the margins and what those codes mean. But yes, you might find some fun little notations in the margins that you're not sure what they mean, or this is how you find the street name of where it is and the house number. So always be sure to look all around the page, or look and see who else is living near your ancestor. Maybe it's another branch of your family tree that is living close to other people. Now I'll show you how to use it on Family Search. So this is another completely free website, no matter where you are. You do want to be sure to be logged in. So I'm already logged in because we looked at some examples of the census earlier. If you don't have an account, you can create a free account. It's an awesome site and you get the most out of it by having that free account and logging in. So the main kind of way to search is by clicking search and clicking records. So right up here, I can search just by my ancestor's name if I want to. We're going to pick a different ancestor. If I click on more options, I can add some of those details. Like, usually when I'm searching a census, I try to put in a birth location, even if it's very broad. and a approximate birth date or range. So maybe I'm not quite sure what his birth year is. Maybe I'm going to add a few years to it. And then I can click search, or I can add a father's name or a mother's name, depending on, or is he married at this time, depending on what year I'm searching for. So here I can see there's about 500 results. So what I can do is I can narrow it down. So right up here in collection, it brings up a little box on the top or on the side here where I can see there's one for censuses and lists. So maybe I just want all censuses and lists, and I need to make sure to click this apply collection filter. So then it's going to take all those 572 results, shrink them down just to 9 because I just want to look at the census. So now here I can see a little snapshot of, oh, this is where they're living. This is what date they did the census. This is his spouse. This seems like the right person. So I can click on the little camera icon and be brought right into that census. So hopefully it'll be nice and easy, and similar to Heritage Quest, it does highlight on the screen where that ancestor is. So again, you can explore these details on them. You can also save a copy. I didn't show you how to do that in Heritage Quest, but there's just a download button right here, and it's similar in Heritage Quest. You just have to look for the little wrench icon, or there's a little save button at the top where you can save it. Another way that you can search, so maybe you're not aware of what census records exist. If we go back to that search and that records area, if you scroll down, there's a little spot that says find a collection. So I could type in something like, hey, maybe I want to look at England census. And now I can see, hey, there's these different years for the England census that, maybe I want to search in a specific year, in 1851 maybe. So then I'll pop in my ancestor's name here. Maybe at this point I don't know much about her and I'm just going to put in her name and click search and see what I get. So, maybe this is the person I'm looking for, maybe not. But again, just from the results page, you click on that little camera icon and be brought into here. And it's going to say, hey, just so you know, this is from the National Archives of London. Thank them profusely for providing this for you. You're welcome. And again, you can see how different an England census is from the US one or from I forget, Argentina one that we looked at a few minutes ago. So any questions about using family search to find your ancestor in the census? All right, let's see if there's any online questions quick. Oh, no, we already answered that one. All right. Next up, I'm going to show you Ancestry. So we are in the library, so I'm going to use the library edition. So to get to the library edition, again, we're going to go back to our apl.org because you can only use this one in the library. So again, we're going to go back to the e-library.
So you have to use a library computer, or do you bring in your own laptop?
You can bring in your own device in the library. As long as you're on the library's Wi-Fi, it will work for you in the library. But you would still want to go through the website to get to the proper area. If you just Google search Ancestry Library Edition, it might not work properly. But thankfully, since this is alphabetical right here, Ancestry Library Edition is right near the top. So we can just click in it. It looks very similar to Heritage Quest because Heritage Quest is also owned by Ancestry. They do lay it out just a little bit different. So you can click on search and go to census and voter list. They break that out right away for you, where if you know you're only searching in the census, you can do your search right here. So I can search another ancestor of mine here. Oh, that's the wrong one. And I can click search. Again, I can put in as many or as little details as I want to. And again, it's going to give me a little snapshot of it. I can click on view to be brought into that one. And you can see the various questions that they're asking. Again, it's very helpful that it highlights it here on the screen for you. And since I didn't show you how to do this in Heritage Quest, right up here is that big save button, where if you send this image home or save it to this computer, those are both options. I recommend saving it to the computer. If you bring like a USB drive with you, you can save them right there, or you can just email them all to yourself. If you do the send image home, it's going to ask you to put in your email address and it will email you a copy of it. You can also click on this little wrench icon. It gives you an option to print or download it if you would want to do it that way as well. The census, though, it prints out a little funky, especially with how it's laid out and how large it is. You know, it's hard to kind of capture it and to be able to read it without it being super small print. So it's very hard to print out censuses if you're somebody who likes to print things. But again, you get fun little details like this one, for example, in the 1900 census, they're asking for a specific birth month. They're asking the females, how many children do you have born and how many children are still alive? So that's really helpful details that unfortunately they don't ask these questions in other censuses. Only in this year they did. Another great way to find other censuses is to go to the card catalog. So to get there, we go click on search and click on card catalog. And this works if you do have a paid Ancestry subscription as well. It's the same kind of process to do this. So I can put in any type of title or any type of keyword in here. I could put like Wisconsin, or I could put census or something like that. Or you could even just use these filters. So right here, the second option is census and voter lists. You can see they have specific time periods, either by decades or by centuries. You could filter it by a specific location if you wanted to. So say I'm looking for European censuses. Maybe I want to look for the German ones, and then it even narrows it down further and further and further. And I can see all the different options over here. I can kind of hover over it or click on it and see a little bit more about it. Each collection kind of has a little bit more about it if you scroll down instead of doing that search right away. So it's going to tell you a little bit about what you might find in here. If you don't speak German, here are a couple common words you might be looking for that you'll find in this census record. So some little helpful tips for you before you start that name search in there. Any questions about searching in Ancestry or Ancestry Library Edition for the census? All right, moving right along. Just kidding. All right. A couple other important things to know. So there is some reported record loss for specific years of the census. So in 1790, they lost some, in 1800, they lost some, and in 1810, they did. So if you're looking for your ancestors in those specific years and don't find them, be aware it might be part of the records that are lost, or you need to try that search different. So remember 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10 different ways of trying to search. Also, if you're not aware of this, in 1890, the census, that 1890 census was damaged in a large fire at the National Archives in 1921. Very little of it still exists. So there's just a few counties around the US, and you can see the link I have in your handout to learn specifically what counties, but I think it's just like random counties in Kentucky and somewhere else. I can't remember. But yeah, unless your ancestors were lucky enough to live in those few counties, you're not going to find your ancestors in the 1890 census. Thankfully, though, if your ancestor was a veteran of the Civil War or the widow of a Civil War veteran, they did do a special 1890 veteran schedule that still exists for some states. Unfortunately, not all of the states. Some of them were lost in that fire. But it's primarily states that are alphabetically from Kentucky to Wyoming. So, if you're like me and you have a Civil War veteran who was living in Illinois, doesn't exist anymore. It's unfortunately lost and you're not going to be able to find it. They do have those records on Family Search, which we just looked at, and Heritage Quest as well, that you could search for those and see if you can find your ancestors. So here's an example of that 1890 vet schedule. So this is one of my Civil War ancestors who just happens to be living in Appleton at the time. So how appropriate to feature him. So you can see it looks completely different than some of the other censuses we looked at because it's a special schedule that lists only the surviving soldiers, sailors, and Marines or their widows. So again, you'd kind of see what details there are in here. So here he is right here. I can see what rank he was, what company he was, what regiment, when he enlisted, when he was discharged. They're supposed to also calculate the length of service, but if you asked me to do that in my head too, I would have left it blank as well. So I don't blame him or the enumerator for not doing the math in their head. But the other important thing to note is you see what number there is over here circled. So it's 42 circled. You want to scroll down because this, if you look at 42 now, it's giving his address. It's giving a disability that he incurred. So he has a crippled arm. And there's also sometimes helpful remarks here that might be a little bit more detailed than what you're aware of. So other people, gunshot in the arm or rheumatism or lost hearing in one ear, little details that maybe you didn't realize were part of their service without having to go forth and get a pension for them. Yes.
The fact that it listed his widow on there, does that mean he's deceased?
So some of them, yes. So right below this is actually the next person, Anna, widow of Milheiser. Yeah. So Ira is still living in this census, but it's kind of like it's 2 lines each. So it's kind of like if he would have had a widow, it would have been widow of Ira Holmes.
So
Yeah.
Anna
Is the widow of this number 43. Yes. Yep.
He doesn't know if it's.
It doesn't list his first name, which is really weird. I've never seen that before. But this guy, Katerina, widow of, it has his first name and last name. So I don't know why they didn't ask her husband's first name. But interesting. So that is an example of one of the special schedules that you can get for a veteran. Kind of fills in those blanks for those missing 1890 censuses. The older US censuses, so before 1850, those are really difficult to use because they only list a head of household by name, usually that male head of household, and very few details. So it usually gives you a number count of selected age groups like females under the age of 5, females between age 5 and 10, females between X and Z. So you can see all the different columns they have on these censuses and you just get a tally or like there's 4 of them or there's 2 of them. So it's kind of difficult to work with those, but don't let it discourage you. What I always tell people to do is start with the most recent census you can find on your family and work your way back. So if your ancestor was alive up until 1922, obviously the last census that ancestor is going to be featured in is the 1920 census. So I'm going to find him in that 1920 census, then I'm going to go to 1910, then 1900, et cetera. Or if there's special state censuses that I can have in between those years, especially that 1890 census, that's the big gap. Maybe there's a state census that also fills in that gap between the 1880 census and the 1900 census. So kind of try to work your way back until you get to those 1850s. Don't start with the 1840 census and try to work your way forward. It's a lot harder that way. I also have a little tip on how to use these pre-1850 censuses. So I take a list of all the people in my family that I'm searching, and I write out how old they would be in that census year. So for example, Paul is part of the family. He's born in about 1830. He's going to be age 10 in 1840 if I'm looking in the 1840 census. He's going to be age 20 in the 1850 census, age 30 in 1860, and et cetera, write down a little list of everybody and do that for those years. And then I use that list to compare it to the tick marks that I find in those pre-1850 censuses. And I find somebody that I think is the head of household with that surname. Obviously, it's usually the male head of household. And I go through each person. Okay, does the sex and the age match for everybody who should reasonably be in this house at the time? Keeping in mind, sometimes young females may marry and be out of the household, or sometimes those older boys, like 15, 16-year-olds, they might be farming on their own or living with somebody else in the family or working and being a farmhand or something, that maybe it's feasible that that 16-year-old boy might not be in the house in this year anymore. So kind of use it as an example. And then what I do is I create a little table in my Microsoft Word to help me compare those documents side by side and make a list, or you can do it in a notebook and match up those people person by person to kind of try to make it make sense for you. I also try to use some of the data from those more recent censuses, which is why you work your way back to try to figure out all the names, all the approximate ages before I dive into those 1850 censuses. And I try to find them in all the possible censuses, even if after they've married and, started their own household, I'm still finding each of those kids in their own census area. So here's an example of the 1830 census I'm going to blow it up for you so you can see it. So it's, listing again, there's the males under these certain ages, females under these certain ages. So you literally just have Aaron Cutting as the head of the household, and there's 4 different tick marks. Super helpful, right? No, it's not. So what I did is I wrote down, okay, each one of these tick marks and what they mean. So one of the ticks was a male between age 30 and 39. Well, from my little cheat sheet about the family, I know Aaron's about age 36. That matches. There's a tick mark for a female under the age of 5. Well, I know Cordelia, she would have been about age 2. That matches. I've got a female tick mark for between the age of 5 and 9. Mary, she would have been about age 6. That matches. Then I've got one more female tick mark between 30 and 39. Well, that's Margaret. That's Aaron's wife. She would have been about 31. All 4 of those tick marks match to the family. So now it seems very reasonable that this is the right family. And all those names and approximate ages that I got from the 1850 census where it lists each person, now I can match them to the 1830 census and confirm kind of that this is the same family that I'm looking for.
The frustration that I have is, looking back, and I practically know people that are back to 1850, but when you go back further and you're trying to find the females.
Yes.
Because the head of household is almost always male, so now you start saying, okay, I know that's Margaret.
Yeah.
Now, how do I find in the prior census where she is, and maybe she wasn't married yet?
Yeah, so if you don't have a maiden name or know anything about her family before she got married, that's really difficult to try to find those females, unfortunately, before they were married to their husband. Yes. Common names are also so frustrating.
Did they even enumerate families under women's names if they had a household?
So head of household, you'd have to look at the census little description of how they asked each question, but I think if there was a male head of household, he would have been listed. When I've looked through any, I think I've seen a few female names listed. Like if she's a widow and she's got, kids. But think about it too, sometimes they got quickly remarried to somebody else because, especially a woman, she needed somebody to help her raise those kids and provide that money to raise those kids. So that's another thing and difficult sometimes. Yeah, you got to get creative. Or yeah, sometimes, or sometimes the men married different sisters because, hey, it's convenient. That one's still single. She slots right in. So fun things that you're going to find when you're searching the really early census records. Again, a little more difficult, but still give it a try, especially after you've dabbled in these post 1850 censuses. Definitely, spend a lot of time in those before trying to dive into those really old ones because it's a little more tricky. It's going to make you bang your head against the wall sometimes. Of course, as I alluded to a little earlier, there's errors in the census. Just like any other genealogy record, there's going to be errors. So some common errors that you're going to see in the census: incorrect age. Again, if you ask me how old I am, I have to do the math in my head now. That's what your ancestor would have had to do. Or if you're asking, that, wife of the household, all 10 kids, how old are they and what are their names? They're going to get a little confused sometimes or be a little off. Maybe they're using a nickname instead of their legal birth name. A lot of people sometimes go by their middle name, or they have a special nickname that they didn't want to use that name, or sometimes the father and the son are named the same names. They use a different name to differentiate between the two instead of junior and senior. Maybe that immigration year that they're listing in the census is off by a few years because if, it's been 30, 40 years since they immigrated, maybe they're going to be off a few years. Or again, we don't know who's giving the details. Maybe they weren't with that person when they immigrated and they just kind of know approximately. So those are just a few examples of some of those errors that you're going to commonly find. Again, remember that one adult in the household, or possibly even a neighbor for some of those older ones, is answering those questions for everyone in the household. They could have given incorrect information, whether willingly or unintentionally. Just like us, they're fuzzy on those details, so take that into account. Use that information that you find in the census as a clue to try to lead you to some additional records to confirm or deny. So use that birth year, that location, to try to locate a birth record for your ancestor, or use that immigration year to try to find a passenger list or a naturalization record for your ancestor and confirm with some more concrete details that that is correct or not. Again, spelling, very incorrect in the census, making it a little more difficult to find your family. So again, if the person could not or did not spell their name, they often resorted to writing it out phonetically. So something like sounds like. Remember, some of our foreign-born ancestors likely had an accent and they were difficult for people to hear what they were saying properly. Especially if that person who's the census taker is, Irish and your ancestor's German, those accents sound different to different people, of course. Again, sometimes they use nicknames or they might have abbreviated a first name like WM for William. Sometimes, again, that informant is just giving incorrect information or perhaps unknowingly lied. Maybe it's a family, they're saying that their grandchild is their child because there's shame in that their daughter had a child and they're, raising it as their own, something like that. You don't know all the specific little circumstances that maybe that's why they lied. Maybe that information's copied down wrong or it's indexed wrong. So I've found my Stilp ancestors, very clearly it starts with an S, indexed with a K at the beginning instead of an S. So depending on the awesome handwriting you have to read, it's going to get misindexed sometimes. A couple tips: if you can't find your ancestor in the census or that image is really difficult to read, I always try looking on different sites. So if you tried on Heritage Quest and get no results, try it in Family Search or try it on Ancestry. Or if that image seems a little darker or blurry or hard to read, try it on a different site. And that tip really works for any different records that you're going to find, assuming that multiple sites have that record type. The indexes are all different on each of these sites, and the image quality is also going to be different on each of the sites. So sometimes it might be easier to find them on Ancestry for this person, and then somebody else, it's going to be easier to find them on Family Search. So that's why I showed you all three of those that are tools for you to use and see if you can track down your ancestors. If you know a family is supposed to be in a certain place, you can always pull up that town or that city and browse page by page for the family. That's a really helpful tip if it's a small town or a small city. Not so helpful if they're living in Chicago and it's hundreds and hundreds of pages. If it's a large city, do you have an address? Maybe you've used a city directory, which we're going to talk about later this year, and you can figure out where they lived. Then you can search by address in the census to find them. So again, this is how I found my ancestors in the 1900 census. So I'm just going to show you quickly how to do that. So we're going to go to the census. We're going to go right to 1900. I know that that's the year I want to look for them. Where are you? Here we go. No, that's 1950. Right, there's the 1900 census. So now I just want to search right in here. So I'm going to prove to you, I put in August Kepschel, who is my ancestor. He was born about 1857 in Germany. And they're living in Chicago, which is a really big city, so I don't want to go through all of them. No results. Well, I know for sure that he's living here. So what I can do is I use this little pencil to edit my search. I'm going to take some of these details out because I know something's wrong here. I'm going to leave Chicago in there because I really do want to search. Maybe I'm going to try by his wife. That's another way. I'm going to say Amelia Kepschel. And I can try searching that way and see if I get any results. Oh, there is an Amelia right here. March 1867, listed as the wife. Could possibly be her. I can take a look. And I can look. And then I see the names of the kids, and I was like, nope, this isn't right. None of these names are the names of their kids. So that's a different August capsule, which is kind of weird that it didn't have it. But look at it, it's abbreviating August, which is why when I searched August, it didn't come up with it. But that still isn't my family. So we're going to go back. We're going to edit our search one more time. I'm going to again take out the name. And since I know what their address was, because I found some other records with their address, I can go under here where it says house number. I know that they're living at 1234. I'm going to make it the exact. And then under keyword, I'm going to put in West 21st because that's the street that they're living on. And I'm going to click search. What? Why are you being goofy now? Maybe I don't do exact because I know this is how I found it. All right, so now I can see all the different people who are living on West 21st, and I can kind of go through the names and see, do any of these look like Kebschel? And keep on going, keep on going. There's still quite a lot of results, so, it might take you a few minutes to find them. You just kind of skim through the results. It's kind of funny that I knew it worked the other way and now it's not working that way. But Ancestry likes to change things, and so does Heritage Quest. Now watch, it's going to be on page 100, and we're going to just go through all of these. Trust me, you can find them here. All right, I don't want to waste all your time. So let's just pretend this was my ancestor. If you hover over it, it's going to say, look at, he's living at West 21st Street in this house number. So say that much.
It's interesting. This place is Poland kind of.
Yeah, so again, you get fun things like that. That, maybe it was technically like Prussia, and at the time it was part of Poland, or one time it was part of Germany. But that's a way. I always would play with these different filters too, because it should have worked if I did it that way, because I know that's how I did it before. So you can try to play with the different results, but maybe I made this exact and this one not exact. Anyway, I know I could find them in here, and that's how I finally broke through, was by searching the address. So that's one way, especially if you have a large city, going through and looking at some of these other ways that you can search. So you can search all these various different ways, depending on what census you're searching in. So you got to kind of get creative sometimes and not always search by their name. But the reason why it was misindexed is his name wasn't listed as August. It was listed as something else, like Gus, which I wouldn't have thought that would be a nickname, but it is for August. You also want to look at your index and the actual image at the same time, because that handwriting might be really difficult to read, but maybe you're going to spot that misindexed name by looking at the image instead, or looking at both together, because maybe it's easier to read on the index for you, maybe it's not. So for example, here in Family Search, I can look at it over here, or I can look at it over here and read it. So I can see kind of both spots, like, is that really Hall or is it not? And see what the names are. In Heritage Quest or in Ancestry, you can, have the image up at the top and then the index down here at the bottom. And again, on Heritage Quest and on Ancestry, both the paid and the library edition, they both work the same. And in order to get that index on the bottom, there's like kind of like a little person with 3 little lines. That's how you put that little index on the bottom of the screen for you. You also want to pay attention to the relationships that are indicated in the census, and remember that they're to the head. So we're looking at John. He's listed as the head. His wife is Gertrude. His daughter is Myrtle. And it says brother Harry. Well, Harry is the brother to John. He's not the brother to Gertrude or the brother to Myrtle. So remember, that relationship is always to the head of the household. Also, very important, you can't prove with the census alone that a woman or a wife is the mother of all of the listed children, unless she is listed as the head of the household and that relationship is specifically said son, daughter, son, daughter. So coming up with a scenario for you, there's a male head of household. He had children with his first wife. She died 8 years ago. He remarried 5 years ago, and then he had children with his second wife. And all the children that he had are listed on the census. Well, who is the mom to all these children? You know, that second wife, maybe she had been remarried too, and she had children by her first husband who are also living in that household and being raised by her second husband. So that's why it's important that you need to locate more than one source for each thing and not just make the assumption that, hey, it lists a male head household, it lists a female who is his wife, and all these 10 kids are, mothered by this wife. It could not be that case. So don't fall into that common assumption. Any questions before we move on to some of the special censuses? Why do you use keyword search for the street as opposed to entering street name? Maybe that's why I got it wrong. Thanks, Beverly. So apparently there is a street name area. Tips for rural 19th century, I honestly would go page to page, depending on how rural it is. Maybe a little town has 10 pages or 15 pages for each town. Go through page by page if you're having difficult finding them by their name or finding them other creative way, like, searching just by their birth year and birth location without a name. Sometimes I've done that as well. All right, state censuses. I forgot we're going to talk about that quickly. So again, some states also took a census, very random. Not all of them took a census, not all of them survived, but they may provide information on your ancestors in the years between those federal censuses. It's going to vary state to state, vary year to year. Sometimes it has more detailed information than in the census of the federal. So sometimes if it's the New York census, it's going to ask specifically if you were born in New York, what county in New York were you born in, which is really helpful when trying to narrow down a more specific birth location. So I want you to check the Family Search Wiki for those individual states. Like we looked at before, we typed in New York census and got all those links to those Family Search collections that I could search through. So again, here's an example of a New York State Census from 1855. Right here in this column, they're asking, if you were born in this state, what is that country or what is that county? And then other people are listing a specific state or a specific country if they were not born in that state. Another helpful column was the years they resided in that city or that town. So you can see, oh, this person lived here for 50 years. That's going to be really helpful in trying to track them down in the previous censuses because I know they've lived here for a really long time. So another little helpful clue that you can use some of these random little details that are in the census to learn more about your ancestor and hopefully track them down in other records. There are also international censuses. Again, their availability is going to depend on the different laws of those countries. So search Family Search, search Ancestry, both the paid and library editions, search Heritage Quest. So you'll see especially a lot of Canada, Ireland, England, Wales, Denmark, Norway, Germany, especially on these sites because those are the most common and most open with their censuses at this time. But again, I've got a link for you in your handout that links me to the Family Search Wiki, and it's got a whole entry all about all the different countries there are, and you can click on it to learn more. So say I wanted to learn more about census records in Poland, I can search Poland census and then find what records exist, see what links there are, et cetera, all these kind of helpful little tips for me about researching in Poland. Again, here's a little example. So this is the 1931 census that I got an Ancestry Library edition. So you can see it looks very different from a US Census. Just briefly, it's, shows you kind of different languages. So it's in French and in English. especially for the headings. But then you can see some of the same data and some of the same questions that they're asking compared to the US Census. But again, every country is going to be different. Now we're going to dive into the non-population schedules. So these are special censuses that were taken that might be also helpful to you. They were completed during the same years as the federal census, but not always completed with every census. So some of the ones we're going to talk about are mortality schedules, agricultural schedules, the manufacturing and industrial schedules, the DDD or the defective dependent and delinquent schedule, social statistics schedules. So many of these are going to be on Heritage Quest and on Ancestry, both the paid and library edition, and some are on Family Search, but again, not all of them are because not every state has digitized these special collections yet. I hope they do eventually because it's hard to have to figure out what library still has them and go find it on microfilm. So the mortality schedule collects information on people who died during the 12 months immediately prior to a census date. But be aware, unfortunately, the deaths were underreported. So if you do find an ancestor, you might be a little lucky that they're in there, because if they took the census in April and that person died the previous September, maybe they didn't remember that and didn't record it. So these were collected from 1850 to 1880 during those census years. And then each of the states that took an 1885 state census also did a mortality schedule for their specific locations. Nearly all of the available ones are on Ancestry, both the paid and the library edition. There are some on Family Search and Heritage Quest, but some are not very complete. So Ancestry is kind of the first stop I would make if I'm searching for one of these. If you look at the 1870, 1880, and 1885 censuses, there's a number in column 1 of the mortality schedule that connects you to a specific family in the population schedule. So if it's number 256, you would go to that population schedule and find family 256. That's the family who reported that person's death. Also, there's also a Canadian one in 1871. It's on Ancestry, also on Family Search. So if you have somebody in Canada who might have died around that time, worth taking a look. So Wisconsin is only available on Heritage Quest and on Ancestry. They do thankfully have the mortality schedule for our state. These also have many other states here and on Family Search, but again, look at all of the different sites. And I also want to point out down here, they have some additional details. So for this one, it says like, example, number 1, drowned while bathing. Well, that gives you a little bit more detail about this person's death. So you can zoom in and kind of see what details they give you. Of course, they give you the name, age, sex, color, their marital status, their place of birth, if their father and mother are foreign born, the month in which the person died. So maybe you don't have a death record for this person, or you've been trying to figure out what month they died. It at least narrows it down for you. What their occupation is, and then their cause of death. So sometimes that's really helpful information for you. And then again, sometimes you get some fun little remarks towards the bottom. Sometimes you get nothing. So it really depends. And again, they don't always have every single death in here, unfortunately. Next up, we've got an agricultural census or a schedule. So this contains information on every farm that had an annual produce worth $100 or more, and it includes the name of the owner or the person who's renting or who's the tenant, the kind and the value of the acreage, the machinery, the livestock, and the produce in very detailed information. So if they were a farmer, between 1850 and 1910, they had agricultural schedules. Unfortunately, somebody made a decision that the 1900 and 1910 agricultural censuses were destroyed by a congressional action, so they don't exist. If you have a farmer in 1900, 1910, unfortunately, those don't exist anymore. On Ancestry, both the library and paid edition, and on Heritage Quest, they do have some of these indexed, but not all are online. Very few are on Family Search. I think it's just like 2 or 3 states. But you want to search for the keyword term of non-population schedules because that's where you're going to find some of these special schedules. Again, Wisconsin's not online for these agricultural schedules. Closest place to Appleton, Brown County Library, the central branch in downtown. They've got it in the same role as the population schedule of the census, but after all the different counties. So you want to look for the roles with the red dots. Those are the ones that have the agricultural schedules, the manufacturing schedules, all that kind of great stuff. Not as great quality because it's on microfilm, but it's better than making a trip to Madison or waiting however many years it's going to be before they finally decide to put them online. If you have a farmer in your life, definitely 100% worth it to get a copy of these because I'm going to show you some of the rich details that they have in here. Also be aware, some of them are multiple pages, so you want to make sure to get every single page that your ancestor is going to be on. So here's an example of an Iowa one because they do have Iowa online. So this one I found on Heritage Quest. So I can zoom in here. This is for 1880 in Jasper County, Iowa. So my ancestor helpfully is number 1. So I can see his name right here. I can see he's the owner. I can see the amount of acres of improved land and woodland that he's got. I've got his value of his farm and of his machinery, of his livestock. I've got the estimated value of all of his farm. I have how many acres he mowed, how much hay he has, how many horses he has. Can't quite read the last column, but you can see some of the details. And then I want to pay attention to what number he is because down here I get more details like how many cows he's got, how many other animals he has, which unfortunately it doesn't list what kind. How many cattle he sold that were living, the value of, or the butter made on the farm in 1870. So sometimes you have to, tilt your head to read it, and sometimes it's a little blurry to read it. I can see he had 55 pigs on hand in the month that they counted it. He had 45 barnyard animals. I can't tell what the 200's for, but you can see all the little details and then see, how many calves they might have had that year, how many pounds of butter they made, if there's any movement with their sheep or their swine or their poultry. I mean, you can just see on and on and on all the different grains and oats and wheat that they had down to, how many acres or how many bushels. So all these little details that you can learn so much about what they were farming and how much they had and how valuable it was for them. So lots of great details. And again, it continues on and on and on in these separate little sections that I can see, oh, they had potatoes, sweet potatoes and Irish potatoes. They had apples. They had, a bunch of other things. They had grapes. How cool. Like they had honey. Like it's just amazing the level of detail that you can get on these. So again, definitely worth your while to get these. There's also manufacturing or industrial schedules. So these are going to be details about products, raw materials, assets, capital invested, and the number of employees. So this included businesses like mining, fishery, mercantile, manufacturing, trading, anything that produced at least $500 worth of product. You're also going to find sawmills, blacksmith shops, flour or feed grain mills, tanneries, coopers, which are barrel makers, cheese making operations. So remember, sometimes our farmers also had side businesses in these rural areas where they were also a blacksmith, and they might have also been featured in this schedule as well. So these started in 1810, but unfortunately most were lost for that year. They did it again in 1820, and then they took a time off where they didn't do it again until 1850 to 1880. So if your ancestors had some sort of manufacturing or industrial business during that time period, worth a shot to look them up and see if you can find it there. It is known by different names throughout the censuses. So 1850 and 1860, they call it industrial schedules. The other years, they called it manufacturing. Many of these are also on Ancestry, both the paid and library edition, and on Heritage Quest. Again, that non-population schedule. So if you go to the card catalog and type that in, it'll get you there faster. Again, not every state is online, so follow up. For us in Wisconsin, it's not online. You've got to go to Brown County or go down to Madison to search for it on microfilm. So here's an example again of Iowa, because for some reason Iowa likes to have theirs online. right, so you can see what kind of business. So it's a blacksmith or a tin mill, and see kind of some of these details about the descriptions of the machines and the type of power that they had and the materials that they had, et cetera, the value of all this stuff. So you can learn a little bit more. Boots and shoes, harness makers, wagon people, lumber people, et cetera, et cetera. So you can see all the different details that they have on these individual businesses. And again, you see it says non-population schedules right up here. So that's the keyword that you want to search under, is that non-population. The DDD is next. So this is the defective, dependent, and delinquent. So this is a special census done only in 1880. Gives additional information on some people in specific situations. And unfortunately, yes, these are the actual terms that they used. So something like insane inhabitant, or an idiot, or a blind person, or a homeless person, or a person in prison, or a pauper. Those are all the different names that they called people at this time. And for each of the situations, the census in here also gives you a definition on how to properly classify it. So what does it mean to be an idiot or a deaf mute? You'll see like a little 1 or 2 sentence description. And no, if you do find somebody in your family, this is what that word meant at this time. You can look at the instructions to determine if your ancestor would have fallen under one of those classifications. Also, prior to the 1880 census, they did have some notation of some mental and physical defects that they asked in those population schedules. So sometimes they list people in institutions or as an inmate, something like that. In the 1880 census, when you're looking at the regular census, if it has a person identified as blind, deaf, idiotic, insane, or permanently disabled, they were also included in this DDD schedule. They do have 21 states online and available on Ancestry, both the paid and library edition, and on Heritage Quest. Kentucky is the only one on Family Search for some reason. Again, follow up offline for any other states that are not online. And again, it's separate from that regular census under that non-population schedule. In Ancestry, I would search the defective, dependent, delinquent. That's the key 3 Ds that they're looking for. Yes.
I was searching in New York State and I found a census that was for prison.
Yeah, so they do index inmates in prisons. Yep.
And that was interesting because they said what they were in for.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, or sometimes you'll see people that are hospitalized, either at regular hospitals or like mental institutions. Sometimes it gives details, sometimes it doesn't. But so here's an example of the DDD. This is for, I forget where, Michigan. So it says insane inhabitants, and you can see their name, their city, what their type of disease is, how long they've had it, if they use restraints and stuff. Like some of this stuff is a little difficult to read. So obviously, if you think you have somebody in this type of situation, understand that it might be difficult to read. Also, usually sometimes we'll give where they were so this one says Kalamazoo Asylum. So then I would maybe follow up and see, can I get any records for this specific person if it's my ancestor, to learn a little bit more about their time here, because clearly they've been struggling with this for 18 years or something, that I'd want to learn more about them. And you can see if you read this a little bit, sometimes they had the descriptions here. I thought maybe if I scroll down, I think it is. If I scroll down, there we go. So I can then look at the idiot, so you can see, what the word idiot, it has special meaning, and then it goes through a little description of what it means to be an idiot. And it's got little notes here that I'd also want to read through to understand this specific classification a little bit better. And we're running low on time here, but we've got just a little bit more. So the social statistics schedule, this was compiled with the 1850 to 1880 census. Unfortunately, there's no information about specific people, but it does give you a little snapshot of the different communities that your ancestor is living in. So some of them are on Ancestry, both the paid and the library edition, and on Heritage Quest, Only Iowa and Illinois for certain years are on Family Search. Again, you want to search under that non-population schedule and follow up for those offline ones that are not online yet. But here's another Iowa example where you can get some really helpful details. So this is for Jasper County. So if I zoom in, I can see the different value of the real estate and personal estate for the people in this area. I can see information on their libraries, on their colleges and schools, what kind of stuff, what kind of debt this area has, the different wages for different, occupations, like what does a carpenter make or what does a female domestic make within a week, what their taxes are like, the different types of schools that they have, different newspapers, which is really helpful when you're searching in the newspaper, different religions, different churches that they might have attended. So you can kind of see the different options that they would have had at this time period. So although it's not listing your ancestor's name, still very helpful. It even has some information about criminals convicted during the year. So that's always fun to know, that if they're living in a safe area or not. So lots of interesting things they've got in here. And these are usually just 1 or 2 pages sometimes. And they're more so at the county level and not necessarily like a specific city or a specific town. I've also got a link in your handout for more information through the National Archives, which will talk to you more about these non-population schedules, because there's only so much I can talk about all of them, but it'll talk a little bit more about specific questions that they have in each of these schedules, and a little bit more. They've even got some business schedules, I guess. So you can even scroll down and see, hey, my ancestor was living in California. Look at, they aren't online. The California State Library has these non-population censuses for California and for those years. So then I would follow up and say, hey, California State Library, I live in Wisconsin. Can you send me this schedule for this person? Or can I find a researcher that I can hire to do this for me? Because it's cheaper to do that than to fly to California. So that's, again, another helpful link in your handout for you. There's also a few other miscellaneous censuses. So American Indians were generally excluded from the federal census before 1900. They were only counted in 1860 and 1870 if they didn't live on a reservation. In 1880, they had a special census of Indians, that is on Ancestry. In 1900 and 1910, they had what they called the Special Inquiry Schedule, which is at the end of a county or a state collection with the regular census. There's also something called the Dawes Rolls from 1898 to 1906 that feature people that are in the 5 tribes of Indian Territory, which is now Oklahoma. So you can get more details in the Family Search Wiki as well if your ancestor is one of these specific situations. Also, enslaved people, of course, they had a special slave schedule for 1850 and 1860, which included the southern states and Washington, D.C., also New Jersey in 1850. They list the enslaver, information about the enslaved, but not specifically their name, unfortunately. So you're really getting their age, their gender, their color. So similar to our like pre-1850 censuses, you're getting the tick marks kind of, or that kind of demographic information and not necessarily names. These are on Ancestry and on Family Search in separate collections. And again, you can find more information in the Family Search Wiki. There's also going to be some territorial censuses. So before each state became a state, it was a territory that they might have taken during certain years. Some of them are online, some of them are offline in libraries. I always recommend checking at the state library level. So like for us in Wisconsin, that's the Wisconsin Historical Society. They have a collection of our territorial censuses before we became a state in Wisconsin. There's also various voter lists in various states and countries that might be available online, which can help also fill in those gaps between the census years that you might find your ancestors in. Of course, also check those main genealogy sites that we talked about for a lot of those other miscellaneous censuses and voter lists. Also in November, our Find Your Ancestors topic is all about voter lists. So if you want to learn more about those collections and how to use them, definitely mark your calendars for that second Saturday in November at 2 p.m. Central. We'll have that program. You can either join us in the library or on Zoom for that as well. I always recommend also looking at your collection description on each of the sites to learn more. So if you look at Family Search, they have something called How to Use This Collection. So for example, I'm looking at the United States slave schedule for 1860. There's a button right here that says How to Use This Collection. So before I do my search over here, click on this and read through all the helpful information they have that might tell me a little bit more about this collection, what I might find in it, and help me use it a little bit better. Ancestry also does it similar, or you'll find it on Heritage Quest as well. So for example, this one, I'm talking about the 5 tribes. If I scroll down here, I can see a lot more historical background, tips on searching in that collection, et cetera, that it would be helpful for you to learn before you start diving into search. Also, if you're having trouble reading any of those blank censuses or any of the censuses and the headings, so some of those agricultural ones were a little more difficult to read, you can click on here and see all these blank forms. So say 1880, I had trouble reading. I can see a lot clearer what all the different headings are without having to, tilt my head, or I can print this off while I'm reading through the census on my ancestor and I have to keep scrolling up and down and stuff like that. That's what I've got for you. Our next session, we're actually going to have 2 sessions next month, one on immigration on October 7th at 1 p.m. And then October 28th, we're going to do naturalization at 1 p.m. In the meantime, we also have Find Your Ancestors on Saturday, October 11th at 2 p.m., talking more about the Wisconsin Historical Society. So if you have not used that great resource, come learn more about it. It's more than just Wisconsin resources. So even if your ancestors aren't from Wisconsin, come learn about it. There's also, if you have any teens in your life, we're going to do a teen-focused genealogy program. They can either join us on October 21st at 2 p.m. or October 28th at 6 p.m., all about how to start diving into your genealogy if you're a teen in grades 6 through 12. So if you have any of those, encourage them to learn how to start their genealogy and get what you have passed down to them. That's what I've got for you, so I'm happy to take any additional questions.
On the census records that are downloadable, are they only downloadable as images or are they available as Excels?
So they're only as images to download. I can't even think if there's a way somehow that you could download an Excel file of it. I don't think they make that functionality through these sites. Otherwise, people would probably download the whole data and then cancel their Ancestry subscription or something like that and, have it searchable somehow. But good thought. Any other questions from our online folks? Don't see the link to the handout. There you go. If you scroll down, you can see the handout. All right, everyone. Well, hopefully I'll see you next month when we're going to talk about immigration and naturalization then. Take care.